Hi there, my name is Tom Patton and I'm going to walk you through how to use Microsoft Excel to update your business data in Dynamics AX 2012. I want to let you know that there's a series of videos on this topic, so if you're interested in further information you may check out some of the related videos shown on this list. Also want to talk about the fact that we'll be really visiting two different personas within this demonstration. One is the template designer. This is somebody who is pretty familiar with the business data and processes in Dynamics AX, somebody who probably also is pretty handy with Excel to build the template, and that will then in turn be used by our end users who may just be interested more in opening up an existing spreadsheet, making some changes to some numbers and publishing those changes back to Dynamics AX. The developer and administrative scenarios are focused on in other videos in the series. So without further ado, let's open up Excel and see how these capabilities work. We'll start by going to the Dynamics AX tab and pressing the Add Data button. This is going to go out to my server and find all of the services indicated with the pencil icon, or queries, those that lack the pencil icon, that I can incorporate into the workbook. Now services, I can go ahead and update the information and send those changes back. Queries are intended only for read-only data access. The sources that are displayed here have been configured by the administrator, and in my case, in my test system here, if I go into Organization Administration and under Document Management, look at my document data sources, you'll see I've set up this set of services and queries, and of course if the administrator wants to expose additional data sources, this would be the form in which they would do that. So let's start getting our feet wet by looking at a very simple service, one that allows the creation and editing of vendor groups. So I'll choose my vendor group service, and now all the fields in that service are presented here in the field chooser. I can now go ahead and either double click or drag and drop my fields onto the worksheet here. So I'm going to add my description and now my payment information and finally my tax information. And what you'll see, I've now included all of the fields of the service on the workbook here, and you'll see that my refresh data button is dimmed. That's because this interface is either always working with the structure of the worksheet when my field chooser is open, or with the data in the worksheet, which is enabled once I close my field chooser. So now my refresh data is lit up here. I can press on it and get the current value for all of my vendor groups. At this point, the spreadsheet is connected to AX, and I can change values in here. If I add the word edit to the end, for example, and hit publish, I've changed the name of that vendor group now in the application, and I can certainly go to payables and open up my vendor groups and see that I now have something called intercompany edit over here. If I make a mistake while I'm entering data here, for instance, if I add an invalid settle period like XYZ and do a publish, I'm going to see that here in my publishing Dynamics AX status tab, I'll see a report for each service that was called and what happened there, and see that I've actually had a failure to publish, and I get a listing of each failed record here, what the key of that record was and what the message was, so I can go back to my worksheet and address those issues here. Now if my end users need to know the valid values for one of these cells, you'll see that there's a field lookup button here that's been illuminated whenever I'm on a lookup field. So for instance, if I'm on description, it's not illuminated, but when I'm on settle period, it is illuminated. If I press this, this is going to give me all of the valid values, so I can choose something appropriate like net 90, hit my publish, and now I'm back to having valid values for all of these rows. Now if this template is going to be used offline or in an environment where there is no live server, or if you just want to provide a different user experience for the end users of this template, there's another way that you can enable these lookup scenarios. That's by opening up the field chooser again. So we're now, our data mode is turned off. We can't refresh the data. We can't publish the data. We can't perform those kinds of actions. But I can come over here to my settle period field, go to its properties, and say I want this field to be cached, so all the valid values for settle period will be placed in the workbook itself and stored in a manner that can be taken offline with me. And I want those valid values to be presented in an in-cell dropdown. So I'm going to say OK here, close my field chooser, and return to working with the data. And now we'll see as I add a new line, let's watch the addition of a new line. Let's say 991 here as test 1. Now as I add new data, you'll see the valid values are presented in this fashion. So I can either come here and choose a valid value. If I type in something like XYZ at this point, I'm going to get a validation error saying that's not okay. And if I want the full experience of seeing the lookup value as well as the descriptions, then I can always return to my field lookup dialog here and choose my valid values this way. Now let's just use Excel's fill down capabilities to create multiple new vendor groups. So here we've got 991 created a number of different vendor groups, and I can go ahead and publish these. And if I go back into my form and hit F5, I'll see all of those have been added. So we've done edits, creations, valid values, lookups, and things like that. Let's go ahead and just prove to ourselves that deletes work. So I'll delete these guys and then delete all my new ones that I just created and publish that. And now if I go back and hit F5 again, I'm back to having my normal vendor groups in my system. So that's a very simple service showing create, read, update, delete, and lookups and caching. Let's move on to a more complicated service at this point and look at a couple of other capabilities. So I can just remove this from my workbook by deleting the data source out of my field chooser. And I'll go ahead and clean up my workbook as well. Just remove that whole sheet. And now I'm going to go and add in my budget register entries service. So budget register entries are a little more complex. You can see first of all that we've got a number of required fields indicated by these red icons. We can also see that this is a parent-child or header line pattern where I've got an entry header that then in turn contains my individual budget entry lines here. So if I look at this in the business data over here in the client, and for instance look at one budget register entry, you see I've got header information up here that's things like the budget model and code and the date, the default date used, and then I've got my individual lines. So there may be 2 or 3 or 100 lines associated with that, the header of that document. So we see that same structure outlined here, and I'm going to go ahead and build a table grid here just for the header information. So I'll add my entry number. I mentioned earlier that all of the key fields must be added to the workbook, so you can see that when I clicked entry it actually added both key segments to this workbook. And then I'm going to add my code, the description of that code, the budget model, and default date. So I've included all of the header, all of the required fields here from my header. I'm going to just go ahead and call this headers. And I'm going to store my lines on a separate worksheet for this demonstration. And in my lines, I need to first of all include the relationship back to that parent. So here my parent dot notation and the key icons are telling me these are the fields that tell, for this line, that tell which header it's associated with. So for instance, if I say include my parent ledger, parent entry name and ledger name here, these are going to correlate to the header fields that we've already added on the other worksheet. I'll continue to add all of the required fields here. So I know I want my date. I know I'm using, and I know that I'm also going to want to use my financial dimensions here in the budgeting process. So this icon indicates that these fields are all financial dimensions. And I happen to know, in this scenario, I know that main account is the only budget-enabled segment in my financial dimensions. So as a template designer, I have to know some information about that so that I can make the right decisions here about which segments to include in my workbook. But I know that, so I'm going to add the main account segment here. I'm going to add the comment. That's the field I'm actually using in this demonstration to contain the account descriptions. So I might as well show you that you can just rename these guys no problem with that. It's still correlated to the proper field, you can see as I mouse around. So I'll call this my account. Let's see, I believe I need currency as a required field, and then finally my transaction currency amount, which is the amount for that period in that account, and I'm going to rename him amount. Now I've added all my required fields here for my lines, but I actually want to also include some header fields here as well. So you can mix and match these fields together in the same list here. If I add budget code here, and let's say I want to put it right there, and I'll see repeating budget codes for each of those lines, the valid code that came from that header. Now before I go ahead and refresh the data here, I do want to filter it down to include only the draft entries. So the filter control is going to give me the ability to see all of the fields in the service, choose them, and then provide a filter criteria. For instance, in this case, I'm going to say only show me the draft register entries. And now I can refresh the data, and I've got the latest version of this data in my workbook, both for headers and for lines. Let's use a little Excel trick here of creating a new window and arranging them horizontally so that I can see both the headers up here, there's about 20 of them, and the lines down here at the same time. You can see there's a few hundred lines. So for instance, this 527 header is associated with these several lines, 527 entry number lines. So if we look at this header field here, and I'll just make some changes here for illustration. If I were going to change the budget code for this, let's say I were going to change it from being budget to an adjustment, when I say OK here, you'll see that that same change is cascaded throughout both the header and all of the lines. So likewise, if I copy this value and I paste it here, you see that these are updated down here. So what this is telling us is that that one field budget code, or any of those header fields, even though they may appear on my lines to show me more information about that line, and I can edit them, there really is only one value behind the scenes there for that budget code, and when you change it, all of the places where it's shown in the workbook are going to be kept in sync. So let's go ahead and just change some information here. If I say 527, if I just make a very simple change, this 18,000, and change it to 20,000, but my remaining lines for this same transaction remain at 17,600, I can go ahead and publish this change, and that one transaction is going to be updated. If I want to validate that in the client, I can just copy that entry number and filter down and see that indeed I have 20,000 for my one line, and my other lines remain unchanged. So I'm updating a part of that document with that change. And now let's move on to a little more user-friendly way of presenting this information. So if you were to present this information to your end user, they kind of have to be thinking about the fact that there's a single document that comprises of this part of the information as well as the correlated information down here. I may want to hide that fact from them and just present them a little more simple of a means of editing this information, and I'm going to use a capability called matrix fields to do just that. A matrix field is going to be defined by right-clicking on any one of my data sources here and saying create matrix field. And in this case, I'm going to actually present two views of the information. I'm showing here a very detailed view of every transaction and every line, and you know, that's great for creating pivot tables or getting overviews or using Excel's sort and filtering capabilities to look at those individual transactions. But lots of times you want to present the information at a more aggregated level, and that's what this matrix field is going to help me do. So in this case, I want to look at my my budget information both for my original amounts, and I'm actually not looking at my amount field but my transaction currency amount field, and my adjustments. So I want to look at those side by side so that I can see what my originals used to be and what my adjustments are that I'm in the process of making in this example. So here again we've got a filter control that's going to let me say which transaction lines here, which ones qualify to be in my originals bucket. And those are going to be those budget codes that are flagged as original. Now this might be a more complex filter in some cases. You may want to show original entries that were not marked as a single time amendment or other kinds of more complicated filters, but for my example I'm going to keep this simple and just keep it to original. So you'll see after I've completed that I've got a new field that shows up here in my field chooser. I'm just going to repeat that real briefly to make one for amendments. And enter the same similar filter here to say that I'm looking at my revisions here, my adjustments. Let's call it adjustments. Okay. So now I've got original and adjustments fields, and I'm just going to create a new worksheet. Let's call it overview, so we can see all of this together. That's going to contain this new view of my information. So in this case I want to include my originals and my adjustments, and I want to show this information categorized by the comments or the account description that we made. So I'm going to just rename this to account description. And then in addition to these native fields or this native data that's owned and mastered by AX, I also am interested in collecting some information that uses Excel formulas. So far everything we've seen, when I click on it, it correlates to a field. There's the comment field, the original field, the adjustment field. This all correlates to real data that's in AX. Lots of times you want your template to include calculations or other ancillary information that can help the user understand the information. So let's go ahead and add a couple of new columns to the table here. Let's do one that's called change, and then actually let's do total first, total, and then change. So we're going to use some Excel formulas later in the demonstration to illustrate how that works. Alright, so I'm going to leave the field chooser, going to close him down and do a refresh of the data now, and now we'll see quite a different view of the information. So let's review. First, the headers. We know that there are this many transactions, 18 transactions or 16 transactions here. Each of those transactions contains many lines. All of that information is laid out in a very detailed format for me here in these two worksheets. And what we've done here is create another view that's more simplified. And I'm going to take just half a second here to do a little bit of formatting so that we can see what this looks like here, and then add a calculation here using Excel formulas. So I just know how to use these just regular simple Excel formulas. So adjustments plus my original is going to end up being my total, and then my change, let's make this a percentage change, which is just equal to the adjustments over my baseline of my original. Alright, so let's make this guy look percentage and format him so we can see where my big changes in the data are, and then do something very similar, and then do something very similar here with my totals. Go ahead and format him properly. So now I can see all of the information that I want to expose to my end user in a very easy to read fashion. I'm looking at my total for the original budget that was added here for my commissions group, and then I am looking at the adjustments that have been made to that, and then I'm able to do typical Excel calculations to further understand that information. Now, what happens at this point when I modify these data? Let's take a quick look at this. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the AX client and filter this down to my training, just this one transaction. If we look at this, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 we've got nine lines associated with this one transaction that are $100 each, and you can see here that my adjustments is exactly what that's correlated to. That's my $900 here. So if I change this, for example, to $1,800, if I double my adjustment and I hit publish, then my end user didn't have to think about, in this case, the fact that underneath the scenes that's actually 9 different lines, and he needs to allocate that expense across those 9 different lines. He just thinks about this as one total for this adjustment, and in the corresponding business data in AX, if I hit refresh, we're going to see that has changed accordingly across my transactions. You can see the same information here on my lines. So if I take my account descriptions down to my training and development, you can see that these 199s and this $200 are the amounts that I have in there. Now it's interesting, from a prior demo I'd actually adjusted this information. So let's say I wanted these to be the same, $200 each for each of these entries. I can go ahead and make the changes down here as well. So if I just paste over all of these, you can see that this is just always going to be kept synchronized. So now I've got a different way of getting to $1,800 here within this line. If I go back to my overview, I see I've got $1,800 when I publish this, and I refresh the data here, you'll see that now is $200 on each line. So that allocation is performed proportionally. So for instance, if those numbers were different, if one of them was, say, $100 instead of $200, I could make a change to just that one. Let's stop our filter here. I could make a change just to one of those and say he's going to be 100 for one of those months, and again that's going to be changing in real time here on my totals that are shown on the worksheet, and once I publish it, then I've changed that one line. We come back in here and hit refresh, we can see that the $100 has just been changed. Subsequently, if I take my $1,700 and double it at this point to $3,400, and publish my data, you're going to see that that's been allocated proportionally across those records, so that when I refresh, they've all doubled. So now I've got 200 for this month and 400 for all my remaining. So the key here is that the template designer has built a template that's easy for the end user to work with by placing these matrix fields here and laying out the template in a way that's easy to understand. The end user can then decide what they want to do. Do they want to adjust these totals and not think about the allocations to the underlying detailed structures? Or do they want to go into the detail section here and manipulate things, say, month by month or account by account? So that's going to be left up to the end user. So just a quick recap of what we've seen here. We've seen simple document services like vendor group, where we're just adding fields and able to do lookups and caching against those fields to enable create, read, update, delete scenarios. And then we've looked here at budget transactions, which follows the pattern of many documents in AX, like journal entries and others that are a little more complex in that they have a deeper shape to them. They have relationships between the headers and the lines, and then we've looked at the matrix field concept here that enables us to aggregate that information and present it in a more simplified fashion for our end users to update. I hope this has been a helpful walkthrough of updating your business data in Dynamics AX by using Microsoft Excel. Please feel free to check out the remaining videos in this series for further information. Thanks.